Good morning and good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Korean Economic Institute of Americas and Korea Society's program. Today, we're marking the official release date of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's new book, and I understand his first book, so it's very encouraging to me. Maybe I have a book in me too. Titled Resolved, Uniting Nations in a Divided World, and it's published by Columbia University Press. Secretary General Ban is a South Korean diplomat who was the 8th Secretary General of the United Nations from January 2007 to December 2016. Before becoming Secretary General, Mr. Ban was a career diplomat in South Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in the United Nations. As the 8th UNSG, Ban Ki-moon's priorities were to mobilize world leaders around a set of new global challenges, from climate change and economic upheaval to pandemics and increasing pressures involving food, energy, and water. He led the efforts for the landmark Paris Climate Agreement, and under his leadership, the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda were created. Ban Ki-moon currently serves as a co-chair of the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens, which seeks to empower youth and women to become active global citizens in creating a sustainable future for us all. He currently holds over 20 positions, including presidency and chairmanship of the Global Green Growth Institute and chairmanship of the Global Commission on Adaptation, the Ethics Commission of the International Olympics Committee, and the Boao Forum in China. I would also like to note that Secretary General Ban has been a long-standing friend of the Korea Society and supporter of strong ties between the Korean and American people. The founder of the Korea Society, General James A. Van Fleet, had developed a deep admiration for the Korean people as he observed them coping bravely with the devastation of the Korean War. He recognized Koreans as people of action. So it was fitting that in 2004, then Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Ban Ki-moon, received the Korea Society's annual Van Fleet Award, recognizing that he is a man of action and made significant contributions to multilateral diplomacy on the North Korean nuclear issue and also in solving problems within the ROK-US alliance. Secretary General Ban, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, dear Thomas Byrne, the President and CEO of the Korea Society, dear Ambassador Kathleen Stephens, Chair of the Korea Economic Institute, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your invitation and kind introduction. It is a great pleasure for me to meet you, albeit through Zoom today. Today, June 15, as was introduced by Thomas Byrne, the publisher, Columbia University Press, has officially released the book, and I am honored to have this opportunity of introducing my memoir, Resolved, Uniting the Nations in a Divided World. I am grateful to President Tom Byrne and Chairperson Kathleen Stephens for organizing this event. Taking this opportunity, let me commend two organizations, Korea Society and also KEI, for their contribution in promoting and understanding cooperation between the United States and Korea. I still take it as one of the most honorable recognition of my works by receiving the James A. Van Fleet Award in 2004 when I was Foreign Minister of Korea. I also recall my participation in the 2016 award ceremony of this Van Fleet Award in my final year as UN Secretary General on May 18, 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our Q&A, allow me to say a few words as an opening statement before you give me some good comments. During my 5 decades of public service both in Korea and the United Nations, I have had not time to write a book. This is my first memoir in my life of public service over 5 decades. I wrote this book because I thought it is my duty to share with the world's people my experiences, be they successful, disappointing, or unfinished. I hope some of my stories will be inspirational to or instructional and encourage people across the world to become global citizens. As you may know, my own life span coincides with the colonialism, wars, dictatorship, and struggle for democracy in Korea and around the world. I myself have gone through those turbulent periods as a Korean citizen, as well as a leader of the United Nations. Though I do not remember the era of colonialism because I was born just 1 year before our liberation from Japanese colonial rule. I was raised during the Korean War in 1950s, came of age amid the terrible poverty, and watched my country grow from dictatorship to stable and prosperous democracy with the help of the United Nations and particularly led by the United States. Without the UN and United States, Korea would not be as she is today. Those experiences grounded me in the importance of peace, opportunity, and international cooperation, beliefs that shaped my life and my tenure as a Secretary General. My commitment continues to this day. I run, as I was introduced by Tom Byrne, nearly a dozen organizations, domestic and international, devoted to sustainable development, climate change, advocacy to human rights, and women's and girls. And I'm also working as a deputy chair. This is a small group of global leaders, presidents, the prime ministers, and the Nobel Peace Laureate. This was founded by Nelson Mandela in 2007. Then I'm now working as a deputy chair of this, the elder. I often wonder if we have forgotten lessons we had learned. One needs only to look at the global temperatures rising, alliances fracturing, and refugees fleeing to understand our precarious conditions. Why are we not improving and doing enough and more? To me, the fault more often lies with the leaders of our world, not the citizens. Too many autocrats and dictators put themselves before their countries and before their people, and their countries before humankind. And these rulers are selfish and short-sighted when they need to think as global citizens. In times of extreme pressure, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, I was disappointed to see even the rich and generous nations look inward first. In that regard, I'm encouraged that the G7 leaders in Cornwall, UK, until yesterday, have made a strong commitment to provide the necessary vaccines and the financial support for climate action. Multilateral organizations, including the United Nations, are now weaker than they were in even the 1950s. The Security Council's perpetual deadlock has cost its credibility. New regional groups are alarmingly diminished because of their internal divisions. At the same time, there are not enough international partnerships. We need more alliances among civil societies, NGOs, international organizations, academics, and philanthropist organizations. These collaborations were so powerful during negotiations on the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015 and Sustainable Development Goals, because they leveraged and combined their unique strength, interest, constituencies, and resources. It was beautiful to see, and it is proof that we can only accomplish when we work together across borders. Governments must work for peace, human rights, and development at home, but they must also accept their collective responsibilities to other nations. This means every country must reduce its carbon footprint, work together in international forums, and use its influence to de-escalate conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, life must improve for everyone, not just those who live in prosperous countries or are members of the favored race, religion, or ethnicity. It is essential that we work to overcome hatred of the other and resist the endless quest for economic expansion, religious dominance, and military power. We have so much work ahead. In fact, that's one of the reasons I finally decided to write my memoir, to encourage leaders, lawmakers, and anyone who aspires to make the world healthier, more peaceful, and more equitable for everybody. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to receive your comments or questions, whatever you may have. Thank you very much.
Secretary General Bond, thank you very much for joining us today and for that very broad and inspiring opening comment. I'm Kathleen Stephens. For those of us who are joining us, I want to welcome everyone wherever you are. And we do congratulate Secretary General Bond on the launch of his book, his first book, but I'm going to guess not his last. But I do want to say, as someone you haven't gotten, I actually have my book right here. I read this book, and the Secretary General packs a lot into about 300 pages. It is certainly a very inspiring story of your own life and your own experience, and I think kind of for me as a former diplomat, sort of a reminder of what diplomacy is all about, working on these problems, even after the headlines maybe fade to something else or move to something else. But also you're looking very much forward to what can we learn and how do we approach the problems of the future. So I have to say, Secretary General Bond, I learned a lot from this book, even about issues I thought I knew something about. You made me recall just how eventful your years as Secretary General were, but even before that. So I have some things I'd like to delve in a little bit more from my own reading of the book, but I also want to invite those who are joining us in this conversation, it's a live conversation, to submit questions or comments that you have through the chat function on Zoom. And I'll try to get to those as we go through the hour. But first of all, I wanted to say something kind of about, I liked your title, I don't know, Resolved. And, you know, we know that resolved is something kind of parliamentary and I guess UN procedure of UN resolutions and, you know, people debating and kind of that classic diplomats on the floor debating and passing resolutions about things. So it evokes that process. But, you know, the word also suggests to me something about your own life story and your determination and your resolve that in making this journey from someone as a young boy, I think as a 6-year-old, as the war broke out on the Korean Peninsula, to leading the United Nations. So I wonder, I was going to start with you know, those early chapters. You talk a little bit about your childhood, of course, and what you experienced, but in that you also talk about the first time you heard about the United Nations, which I thought was very interesting. Could you relate that for us a little bit?
Well, I didn't expect that my life would end up with being a Secretary General many, many decades later. In 1956, many people still may remember, there was a big citizens uprising during the Soviet era in Hungary, It was 1956. Korea at that time was a strong anti-communist under President Seungman Lee. And we knew that through news. And most of the students and young people were staging demonstrations within Korea. We were shouting out against the Soviet Union, please save young children. Then I was a representative of our school, and I read out a statement, of course in Korean, to Dag Hammarskjöld, then Secretary General. Mr. Secretary General, please help young children who are being trampled under the boots of Soviet soldiers. That message was read out loud and clear. Exactly 50 years after, I was standing on the same podium where Dag Hammarskjöld was standing. It was quite coincidence. Then during my acceptance speech as elected Secretary General, I asked the member state, introducing this 1956, during my time as a Secretary General, I would hope that I should not receive this kind of appeal letters from young children. But of course, my humble wish was not kept. I still, had to see so many young people had to suffer from conflict, but mostly from hunger and disease, and also lack of opportunity for being educated. So that really broke my heart. I was feeling very sad. That's why I really wanted to do much more for youth. That is something which really, retrospectively, it just brought me 50 years later to the United Nations. That may be coincidence, but I don't know whether it can be called the predestined life. But I cannot say so. I cannot say it is a predestined, but somehow I am honored to have served as Secretary General for 10 years. Then another issue, I talk a lot about the global citizenship. As you may have read, in 1962, I was lucky enough to be selected as one of the 4 Korean students, 2 girls, 2 boys, who came to the United States at invitation of American Red Cross. Then we were all brought to White House and we met John F. Kennedy. At that time, I didn't meet my mayor of my small town. I was just a young boy. Then he was telling us that while world leaders were not talking each other, but you young people, you can be different, you can do. And with the transformative development of communication, transportation, this world has become a very small one. So, but the question was that whether you are ready to extend your helping hand.
Secretary General Bond, it's always extraordinary to think that in 1962, as you say, you were one of 4 South Korean students who traveled to the United States and went to the White House and saw John F. Kennedy. I'm thinking of all the world leaders of the past some years who say, as young people, they were there on the White House grounds. And I never met John F. Kennedy, but I was in the Peace Corps in Korea a decade later. And I want to say for our listeners who may not be aware, I mean, even when I was in Korea in the 1970s, I knew no one who'd been to the United States, certainly not students. It was very difficult to get a passport. There were currency restrictions. So the fact that you were in the United States in 1962, again, it seems like almost a kind of a destiny in a way that you had this early exposure and then came back and became, of course, a diplomat for a young country, the Republic of Korea, which was a very different place than it is now. And of course, we're going to concentrate, I think, in our conversation on your time in the UN. But but you had this long career and very successful career as Korea's diplomat in some of the toughest places, and you do write about that in the book, building relationships when people didn't really think that South Korea was going to amount to much in many places. And then, of course, being national security advisor to two of your presidents through this period of democratization, and then foreign minister, which is when I think I first had the opportunity to meet you back in 2005 when you were foreign minister. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about being a South Korean diplomat and the difference between maybe being a diplomat and rising through your own country service, representing your country, and then moving to the UN, where you have a very different set of responsibilities. How did that prepare you, and what were some of the differences?
The main difference is that while I was, and I'm still Korean citizen, but I was not supposed to work for Korea, and I had to be a global leader, and I had to care all the citizens around the world same. So that was a little bit difficult for me to adjust myself. So I tried to act as global leader. I have worked 37 years as a Korean diplomat. Then now suddenly changing my stance as a global leader. That was not easy, but soon I realized that I should not think much about my home country. Korea is one of the 193 member states, so I should be treating them equally. But in a private capacity, I was, of course, more, trying to meet Korean people, but I really wanted to be fair and equal and try to do much more for Africans and other developing vulnerable countries, because I was this very successful success story of a very vulnerable group of people becoming, global citizens with the aid of United Nations and United States, particularly at the time. I had to study on the textbook provided by the United States, the UNESCO, and UNICEF. All these are something which really made me, from the youthhood, having some global citizenship.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, one thing that's very striking in your book are the stories that you tell of traveling as Secretary General. Obviously, you did a lot, and I know sometimes it was in rather dangerous circumstances and often very uncomfortable circumstances. But there was always a mission to it. It was about the global sustainable development goals. It was about climate change. It was about negotiations and conflict. And I think it really does give people a flavor of the workaday world of being the Secretary General, and this need to turn from one crisis to another, and then sometimes to a lot of crisis prevention, as you suggest. And I know when I was in Korea as ambassador, you were Secretary General. We didn't see you in Korea very often, and people often said, no, he has no time to come to Korea. But the other thing I thought was interesting about your book and the way you organized it is you had a chapter in there about an earlier time in Korea while you were still a Korean diplomat, but you were assigned to the UN when South Korea held the UN, I think, General Assembly chair or presidency.
Oh, yes.
And that happened to be, when the September 11th, 2001 attack happened. So
Mm-hmm.
I would highly commend that chapter as a real kind of, view of, what happens when something, I think a lot of us, maybe even in New York, haven't really thought about, okay, what happened at the UN and that terrible day, terrible day, and how, you and your colleagues had to kind of mobilize the international community to respond.
There is a saying, I don't know how to express it. The iron becomes stronger and hard when it is, burned. But then it was a totally unexpected crisis, which we were met. The September 11, 2001 was exactly the day when the Korean then Foreign Minister Han Sung-soo was to be elected as president of the General Assembly. But in the morning of that day, September 11 terrorist attack happened. So the outgoing president had already left, and we had to evacuate. Nobody could enter the United Nations, so there was no General Assembly. So only September 12th, we were just secretly meeting. We were told by Kofi Annan at the time that this meeting will be only for electing the president of the General Assembly, because at that moment, all this, except the Secretary General, president of General Assembly, all chairmen of the committees were empty, vacancy, because they had legally left. So it was about half an hour secret meeting where President Han Sung-soo was elected, and we were negotiating some urgent resolution condemning strongly the terrorist attack. But even that moment, there was a big argument. What's the terms of terrorism? There is no such definition even now about terrorism. So this is quite unfortunate. The international community has not been able to have a firm agreement about the definition of terrorism. So I was very forceful that we must condemn this heinous terrorist attack in any way, whatever the terms of definition of terrorism may be. This was terrorism. So we were really decisive and forceful. Then I had to negotiate in such a dramatic, dangerous situation. I believe that at that time, the member state, particularly ambassadors, might have seen some decisiveness and decision-making, as well as problem-solving of my own role as a chief of staff to the president of General Assembly. So following several months was all continuation of tense, and the security threat. So under the situations, we were managing General Assembly, United Nations. So that was extremely challenging, but looking back, it was a great experience, That really helped me as a Secretary General to address all these crisis things. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly extraordinary preparation for the role that you later took. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about the relationship between the United Nations and the United States, which is a very important relationship. You know, sometimes the United Nations has been politically, controversial, if you like, in the United States. The U.S. clearly, though, has, takes great pride, and I think obviously in our role in the founding of the United Nations. You enjoyed the support, I'm happy to say, of the U.S. administration in your own rise to be Secretary General and throughout. But could you say a little bit about managing that important relationship?
Of course. Legally speaking, every member state is equal. All 193 member states are equal. But the United States, I can dare say that is the most important member states, not because they are host government, but because they are leader country in this world, upholding the principles and values of the United Nations Charter. And the United States led the establishment of the United Nations. Then officially, legally, then I have to treat all 193 member states equal and fair. But in terms of contribution, financial contribution, in terms of leadership, political leadership, in leading all these agendas, particularly when it comes to human rights and peace and security, and also as a member, permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So it is the United States who had been really leading and supporting the United Nations. That's the largest contributor in terms of the values and principles and leadership. That is one thing. At the same time, it's not always that United States is liked by certain member states, particularly when it comes to non-aligned states, non-aligned movement. Therefore, it is very delicate to harmonize and balance my role as a Secretary General in dealing with the United States and other non-aligned countries. So far, I think the United States, it is the United States which has really been leading this United Nations as the trusted and working, functioning organization. There is another aspect, how we see sort of permanent members of the Security Council. Then often the United Nations has not been able to take any decision. Whatever the case is, however dire circumstances and dangerous situations, divisions among P5 sometimes made the United Nations unworkable but functioning. This is one thing. Of course, United States is one of the countries which has been, leading Security Council, but also casting veto powers, particularly when it comes to Middle East issues. And Russia also is the most, veto exercising member state. China sometimes. Therefore, my strong wish is that to make United Nations more actively functioning, trying to address all the global issues, particularly peace and security issues. And there should be some unity among P5s. And that, I think, the United States can also lead. United States can also play a leading role. Yeah.
I think your description now gives some context to why I think the first UN Secretary General called the job the most impossible job in the world. And I'm sure
Yes, that's right.
Ask, why would anybody take it? But I think your own life story kind of tells us that you're resolved to do these impossible jobs. But it gets to the question of then negotiations. I mean, in a sense, a lot of what the UN and the Secretary General in particular is bring so-called good offices and negotiations, whether it's among the P5 in New York or even more. And you have many examples in your book of going or sending your representatives to places from Gaza to Myanmar, to efforts to go to North Korea, to a variety of other, Haiti, to other places where there's either humanitarian disasters and or political conflict, and trying to play that role. And you describe yourself as a negotiator as trying to be like water. So I guess we don't have time to go into every negotiation you were involved in, because that would be hundreds. But I would love to hear your thoughts about what you mean by that negotiating style and how you could use the UN in your own position as Secretary General. If there's any example where you think it worked well, or it just kind of proved really, really very frustrating given the constraints, and advice you have for all of us who try to negotiate in our professions.
And this has some philosophical aspect. There is some difference between Western and Eastern the world, particularly when it comes from Asia. And it's a different style. They have some different style than the Western people. And there is a tendency for people to believe that when you speak out loud and you take decisive action and quite strong actions, whatever the case may be, then people may say, well, he's a good leader, strong leader. But strong leader does not necessarily be always a forceful and hard hitting or strong person, strong personality. As I come from Korea, and I have been educated under the influence of some Oriental, philosophy, particularly, Confucius and Lao Tzu, and there are many ancient philosophical leaders. What I have been saying that the very famous Chinese philosopher and educationist Lao Tzu said that the highest virtue for a man is to act like water. But people does not care much about, does not appreciate much about water. Jokingly, often people saying that, well, he's spending money like water. That means water does not have any value. But it is much, much, valuable one. First of all, water doesn't have any color, does not have any taste, but there is a continuity. Water always flows from top to bottom, from high to low. If water does not flow, stagnant somewhere, that means corruption, what we can call stale, corrupt. The water does not always argue or confront with the people, with something which water meets in the course of their flow. But when it is absolutely necessary, nothing can be stronger, mightier than water. People may just feel that fire is deadliest, but fire can be extinguished by water. And during tsunami and big flooding, water can roll and move big stones, even steel ferro concrete buildings can easily be washed away by water. Therefore, but it's not always that you use that kind of a force. But that's why I always try to tell the people, particularly UN staff. I have been speaking to UN staff so many times about the water, act like water, smooth, but unless you are absolutely sure, do not get angry and do not push around the people. So try to convince. This has been my sort of philosophical belief. Then during the ceremony of my inauguration for second term, I also quoted what the Lao Tzu said. The way the heaven is doing is not to endure. The way, this scholars or saints does is to help other people. So that has something to do with the member states of the United Nations. And when you deal with the conflict issues, it's not that I have always been soft-spoken. When I was speaking softly, people were criticizing me that I'm not the man of leadership, strong leadership. But I have been confronting when it was absolutely necessary with many dictators in front. And I have been really trying to tell them straight word. But normally, it's not what I've been doing all the time that way. I've been always trying to listen first and respond to their concerns.
Yeah, no, that comes through in many of the anecdotes that you tell in great, very insightful detail in your book. But I would second a comment we have from one of our listeners today who says what you say about the water and that style. It's so true. The loudest voice doesn't mean it's the wisest voice, and we all need some more wisdom. I mean, looking back, are there issues or challenges that you handled as Secretary General that you would say that you're most proud of? You spoke about encouraging global citizenship, about the urgency of climate change, and certainly you were yeah, not so much a loud voice, but a very persistent, persuasive voice on that, and a very passionate voice on that. But looking back, what are the areas where you feel the most, if you like, satisfaction about your ability to influence the world and the UN?
I do not want to talk about the conflict resolution issues, because those conflicts are either still going on or has not been resolved. So most of the conflicts. And then the important, one of the important aspects of the United Nations Charter is development and human rights. Of course, peace and security comes first, but peace and security, that is still going on all around the world. Then I thought that we should do we should provide some vision for sustainable world. How to make sure that there is nobody who would suffer from abject poverty. And there should be nobody who should suffer from preventable diseases. And there should be no discrimination because you are born as something like a woman, or you are born as with a handicap, or you are born with some different sexual orientation, or you are born as some different ethnicities, etc. So there should absolutely be no discrimination whatsoever. So that is what we have presented in the form of Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, this is a successor vision of Millennium Development Goals. But Millennium Development Goals was very limited in scope. It was mostly just for the developing world, and hunger, gender empowerment, and also some disease control, global health, like malaria, HIV/AIDS, etc. But this Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals, cover virtually whole spectrums of our human society as well as planet Earth. So that was a very important one. I think I can tell you that this Sustainable Development Goals is by far, in the history of the 70 years of the United Nations, at the moment, the most ambitious, the most far-reaching vision for human being and the planet Earth, so that we can live together, including climate change. Climate change is one pillar of these Sustainable Development Goals, but because of the urgency and importance, this climate change was taken out as negotiating. This is a treaty, just while other goals are political statement, political agreement. Therefore, we have to make sure that climate change must be implemented in full by at least by 2050. We have to make a carbon neutrality, whole world. Otherwise, we'll be in trouble. Human being will not be able to live any longer in a sustainable way. The WMO, World Meteorological Organization, as UN specialized agency, announced that during last 200 years, we have already consumed 1.3 degrees Celsius. So that means there is only 0.2 degrees left until the end of this century. Can we do that? That is why the G7 leaders, just until 2 days, they made the very firm commitment that we have to make sure that carbon neutrality by 2050 must be achieved. And they are ready to provide $100 billion a year for developing countries adaptation and mitigation efforts. And another area is that I established UN Women. This is a new one, the super agency dealing with the gender empowerment. Until 2010, when I established, with the wholehearted support of General Assembly, UN Women, there was only 4 small divisions. Like UNIFEM was the biggest one, but other 3 was very small divisions here and there. So I integrated as a whole and full-powered unit to dealing with the gender empowerment.
Yeah, looking back, and it's not so long ago, I really see in the things you just outlined, the sustainable development goals, the emphasis on climate change, on women's issues that you outlined. I mean, laying the groundwork for some of the issues that I think we all regard with so much, I think, more urgency, even more urgency now, and maybe it's a little bit late, but as we emerge from this post-pandemic and economic recovery, hopefully, I think all of that work, and I know you continue to do it in your foundation, will have laid the foundation for us to be able to act more decisively and more successfully. We don't have a lot of time left. We have a lot of questions coming in now. So if you'll stick with us for a few minutes, I wanted to get to some of them. Today is actually the anniversary of 21 years ago today, the North-South Korea joint declaration between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il was declared after historic meetings in Pyongyang. And we are from the Korea Society and the Korea Economic Institute here, so we have a lot of listeners interested in Korea. You write a lot about it in the book, your own efforts, but looking at things now, I have a question that's actually, I'm going to paraphrase here from Radio Free Asia, Albert Hong, and he says, what has the UN recently accomplished on the Korean Peninsula, including on denuclearization? What should be done? And what would you like to say to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un for peace on the Korean Peninsula and around the world?
You have a very good sharp memory of June 15 when 2000, when President Kim Dae-jung and North Korean leader Kim Jong-il met in Pyongyang. That was the first ever summit between the 2 parts of Korea. Then after that, the President Roh Moo-hyun and also President Moon Jae-in had 2 summit meetings and 1 very brief one. So 2.5 summit meeting. And also for the first time, the former President Trump had 2 formal meetings and 1 meeting in Panmunjom. So in terms of the number of meetings between the South and North, and even between United States and North Korea, leaders have been meeting. Unfortunately, until now, the relationship between South and North Korea has not developed as much as we had expected, and as much as they should have done. That is because there is still heightened tension on the peace, about the peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. This North Korea has developed nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and these ballistic missiles can reach even the United States. According to most recent report by SIPRI, this is Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The report said that North Korea seems to have had at least 40 to 50 nuclear weapons developed. Nuclear weapons. This is a very serious one. Therefore, there must be a continuing negotiation between the 2 parts of Korea. And in that regard, joint a summit meeting between President Biden and President Moon Jae-in recently in Washington has given a very strong message to the world and to North Korea. At the same time, the recent G7 summit meeting issued a statement that they support a complete verifiable, irreversible abandonment of nuclear weapons as well as ballistic missiles. Now, until now, there have been bilateral agreement between US, North Korea, between South and North Korea. But now this kind of joint statement by G7 really gives a much more significance that this is the collective will of the all peace-loving and also most powerful countries. I sincerely hope that the North Korean leader and the officials really come out with a genuine mind to keep this previous agreement between the two leaders, between South and North, and also United States and North Korea. I sincerely hope that President Biden will also be able to continue this path of dialogue with North Korea. But I know that the President Biden has a different style from President Trump. President Trump has a top-down, while President Biden seems to be bottom-up approach. But whatever approach it may be, it's important that there should be an agreement. And once agreement is made, this must be kept and implemented. That is the matter of confidence and trust. But unfortunately, I can tell you that there is not much trust each other, particularly on the part of North Korea. Now, there is another aspect why we are very much seriously considering the continuing dialogue with North Korea is that, of course, every country is now locked down because of the coronavirus. But when it comes to North Korea, it seems to be much more serious because they have completely shut down their borders because of the fear about the coronavirus. They do not have any capacity to handle this one. No vaccine and no such precautionary measures. Then because of the North Korea is under at least 10 UN Security Council sanction resolutions, their foreign trade has completely been cut off. So they are completely isolated. And that's why North Korean leader has recently announced so-called the arduous march, which was announced during the time of Kim Il-sung in 1990s. Right. At that time, more than 3 million people starved to death. Then the economic situation seems to be very seriously dire at this time. Therefore, I hope that North Korean leader will come to the senses of the reality and come out for genuine dialogue. We are ready. I'm sure that President Moon and President Biden, they're both are ready to come out. What's the use of having all these nuclear weapons? Are they able to use this? North Korea is the only country who has tested nuclear weapons in the 21st century 6 times. So they are going against the age, against the times. So I really hope that they come out to their own senses and try to be part of responsible members of this international community. Then that will really help. I know that the President Moon and South Korean people are ready to embrace and help. But at this time, we are not able to do that because of all Security Council sanctions, unless they are relieved from these sanctions. And then as long as they keep their promises, then I'm sure that the American government will be able to discuss this matter with Security Council members, what to do about all these sanctions. That's up to North Korea.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary General. I hope they hear that in Pyongyang. It's very, very eloquent. And it makes me think also we should do another session on the Korean Peninsula in North and South Korea, because another thing that comes through in your book is your long experience both as a Korean diplomat and then at the UN with this the unfinished business on the Korean Peninsula, which of course has been with us for our lifetimes. We cannot give up. We must be resolved. So thank you for that. We are coming really to the end here. I don't want to detain you too long. I know it's very late in Seoul, but I have a couple of other questions that have come in. One is actually about the current kind of atmosphere in the United States. I know you've been in Seoul. You were telling me earlier since the pandemic began, but someone wants to ask you, in the U.S. now, there's this current, very unfortunate, anti-Asian incidents and sort of atmosphere and worry about that sentiment. Was this something that you ever experienced in your life as an Asian, as a Korean diplomat?
Personally, I have not encountered the experience of that kind of unfortunate incidents. But as you will, everybody will agree that to tens of million people around the world, America used to be land of hope, land of future. That is why US has been receiving many immigrants, and there are many Koreans have immigrated into, and they were well settled. But somehow recently there have been some very unfortunate, undesirable, and unacceptable situations where some ethnic group have been, attacked and by certain, group in the United States. I hope that while we are living in the 21st century, and while we have been, doing all this on the human rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when everybody is equal, whatever the ethnicities and whatever the situations may be. So there should be some leadership, strong leadership, and compassionate leadership, that we are all brothers and sisters, we are all global citizens. There is no such a difference between Americans or even white and blacks or Asians, Africans, and Middle East Arabs. This is one world. We are living in a very small planet Earth, and there is no difference between the borders and the ethnicities. This is what I have been speaking out about, the global citizenship. Global citizenship. We are global citizens. It doesn't, care where you are coming from and what you are. So I hope that particularly the political leaders and educational leaders, they should do much, much more to inform the public that we are all same brothers and sisters and working for sustainable peace and future for all. That is in the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations.
Secretary General Bond, it's been such a pleasure to see you and to catch up with you. I think with those really very moving words, I think we should we'll call an end to this session, but I hope we can talk again. The book Resolved really is a textbook, I think, for global citizens, but it really is a reminder that the work is far from over. And I especially liked what you had to say about, you didn't really want to talk about some of the conflict resolution issues because they go on. And I see that in my own modest career as a diplomat. People think that, you finish something and you walk away from it, it's over. It's never over. And sometimes it even gets worse again. So we need that new generation of global citizens. And I think your book, not only your life is a testimony, but your book is a great contribution to that, as I know the work of your foundation and all the ways in which you're involved, including with the elders in going forward. So thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to welcoming you back to the United States when we can all travel again, and to seeing you traveling, I'm sure, around the globe yet again.
Well, thank very much for this opportunity. It has been a great honor and pleasure to say something about what I have been thinking and I have been practicing as Secretary General. I will continue as a private citizen to do whatever which I can. But as you might have read in the book, I am still holding many international positions on climate change, on other global citizens. So I will continue my role as one of the private citizens, but also as one of the global leaders. And I count on your continuing leadership as chair of KEI, and also I count on Tom Byrne as president of Korea Society to promote mutual understanding, and also global citizenship for our peace and prosperity of the world. I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for your example of public service and your
All the
continuation.
best, all the best. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.